Hey there, grab a cup of coffee and join us in an entertaining and thoughtful conversation about parenting. We're tasting new coffee every episode and diving into a deep conversation about the inevitable speed bumps and seasons we'll encounter as we strive to be the most successful parents and spouses we can be. Welcome to Family Brew Podcast.
So, what are we drinking today?
Stumptown Coffee Roasters, organic coffee, whole bean creamy and caramel. Tastes like coffee.
We were noting that it looked actually a little bit light, right?
Mm-hmm.
In color.
It smells pretty neutral too, in my opinion. In this anyway.
Does it say, is it a light roast or it doesn't?
It doesn't say anywhere on the package about light roast, dark roast.
Ooh.
Versatile.
Two out of 5.
And full-bodied blend. Bright burst of citrus
I
that
like
pairs
it.
perfectly
I
with creamy
think
notes of caramel.
Does it taste
like
creamy?
Well, creamy because I put creamer in it. Yeah.
And the package says "Good luck." What does that mean?
Good luck.
Good luck drinking this. Good luck.
Let's see.
2 out of 5.
Really?
2? I was going to say maybe
It's not bad. It doesn't
4.
taste bad. It just doesn't wow me. It tastes like a million other coffees I've had before.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat.
No, this is really good to me. I get like a less sweet creme brulee almost flavor, like that toasty sugar, which is what creme
It does have a
brulee is, right?
creaminess to it, but I can't.
Do you have creamer in yours?
Yes.
We don't. Ours
I
is
can't
black.
take that out. Does it taste creamy? No.
I wouldn't say it tastes creamy.
I don't get a creamy, but I get the caramely, but it doesn't. It's
I
not
don't get
smack.
caramel.
Really?
Mm-mm. My palate might
You said 4?
It's subtle, which I like.
You
I
said
don't
4?
like, yeah, I said 4.
You said 4?
3.5.
Oh man, now I got to do math because I was going to give us a total out of 20.
It just add 0.5 to whatever the
I know. Or subtract 0.5 basically. All right. So I said 2. You said 2. 3.5. So we're at 7.5, and you say what?
4.
So 11.5 out of 20.
Out of 20. Wow, that's a high bar.
So, have you guys ever lost anything as a kid that you
No,
can remember?
never.
Anything important that you still remember losing?
Yeah. And then I found out much later that my mom helped me lose the item.
Sounds like a therapy session.
No.
She helped you lose the item. She lost it for
There
you.
was a doll that I called Gaga. It was my favorite doll. And I always had it. I just carried it everywhere with me. And
Give us an age. How old were you? Were you like 13 saying Gaga?
I would have been around 5.
5. Okay. All right. Hey, that helps.
So, and then one day Gaga was gone. And my mom said that Gaga was pretty gross at that point. And so she helped Gaga disappear. But she was my favorite doll in the world.
And you still remember it. How recently did you find out that your mom...
I would say, like 5-6 years ago.
Oh, wow.
She admitted her part
Wow.
in eliminating Gaga. She just said it was so gross that she just didn't see a point in keeping it anymore at that point.
How deep did that cut?
There could be worse things that your mom could reveal to you as an adult. Like,
hey,
I was in the mafia from 98 but she told you she tossed your doll.
Yeah.
How about you guys? You guys lose anything you can remember? Anything important?
I can't really put my finger on anything right now.
When we say lost, are we talking about losing an item? Like, oh, I misplaced it. Or are we talking about like
not temporary, like you just never found it again.
I lost a dog.
Sure.
Like she passed
Oh, you
away.
lost a dog?
How
How old were you when that happened?
No. I didn't actually lose a dog.
Oh.
I'm saying like the dog died. Like,
Well, that's a loss.
okay.
How
Well, all
old
right.
were you when that
I
happened?
thought you, like I said, did we misplace it? Did it get out?
We knew where it was. It just ceased to.
Yeah. It just needs to live. Gosh, multiple dogs. I think like most kids, it's just something that you deal with, loss. And then I had a 6-year-old cousin who died when I was in high school. So I lost him and just loss. When I think of loss, I think of it in a more human space. Like
Rather than an
life.
item.
Yeah, items they're replaceable.
Well, that's kind of good because that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So one of my earliest memories, and it's one of those memories where I know that I remember part of it, but I've also heard the story from other people's perspective. And so I feel like the entire memory is actually also partly stuff that I've heard about too. And I have a hard time separating out all that. But I remember a moving truck being in my driveway when I was 4. At that time, I lived with my whole family. I don't have any memories of like my mom and dad and our family together. But that's where we were at the time. And I do have that memory of like looking out a window and seeing a moving truck, which I didn't know what it was at the time. Just a big truck. And that's probably the culmination of the point when my dad left our family, I would say, to decide to bail on us. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, my story tonight. I want you guys to like ask any clarifying questions because I've never really got out the whole story, especially to a big audience like this, and I don't plan on doing it again, so I would love to just be done with it. And so I know that there are some listeners that are going to hear this and like learn a little bit about what abandonment looks like, what it feels like, what it can lead to as an adult, and what it can do to a kid. And then there are going to be some people that recognize this story because it's theirs, and they're going to be able to relate on some level. If you are that person who's ever dealt with abandonment, and that can look a bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's a parent bails when you're a kid. Sometimes it's you lose a parent to a death as a kid. They say that widows can go through some form of abandonment because they're losing somebody close to them. If you are that person, I recommend like digging into books, like reading about it, and even possibly going to therapy about it. I have done that, and it was helpful. And also, I was thinking about this today. What would be super powerful is if there's somebody that would ever be listening to this that may be considering or pondering maybe abandoning their family or splitting up their family, that could sort of hear how it ripples down through a child and even sometimes multiple generations, and would decide to like think that through a little bit. I think that would be the coolest thing that could ever come out of us talking about this tonight. So if you're listening and you feel like you know someone who may be almost there, let them listen to this or some other form of hearing what abandonment does. I have 3 siblings, so there was 4 of us growing up. My older brothers are, I think, 6 and 8 years older than me, so they were in a much different season in life when all this kind of went down. For my twin sister and I, even though we were the same age, I think we process it much differently. But my older brothers, so I'll talk about through my lens in a minute, but my older brothers were like junior high-ish. And so for them, it was like their whole worlds came crashing. Like they knew what it was like to have a full family and then not anymore. So I know for them, that was a whole different set of, I don't know, struggles and stuff they had to process. And there are books on that, like depending how old you are, like how it affects you. I can only just tell you about my perspective. So I wasn't old enough to be able to remember a full family and then have that torn away. But I was the kid that like, I walked to the corner, which was, we just actually traveled down there to show our kids what it looked like where I grew up. But at the corner, there was a junior high school with a park and stuff. And that's where Little League was played in our neighborhood. And so I was the kid that like would go down there and watch all the dads play baseball with their kids and watch them watching their kids play Little League and stuff. And so I just kind of like, I grew up knowing what it was like to live without a dad, but I didn't grow up knowing what a full family was and then have that ripped apart. And it was a little bit different. A lot of people in my category where you're too young, I've read about, they create like imaginary friends and kind of reason with that person. And I definitely didn't do that. I kind of internalized it a lot. And I remember having this reoccurring dialogue with myself of like, just having to talk myself off a cliff in a way and like reassure myself it was temporary and you do have value and stuff. And I had a 6th grade teacher. His name was Mr. DeMille, David DeMille. If you could ever hear this, I hope you do at some point. I kind of told him this in a little bit, but anyways, he took an interest in me. I was in like a special like extracurricular program at school. It's not important, but he headed that up, and so he got to kind of see me up closer. He was my 6th grade teacher, but he got to see me in like a smaller setting and get to know me and stuff. And somehow, and I know my mom and him had some conversations, but he noticed right away that like I was lacking a father figure, and I think he saw some of the symptoms of what that looked like and stuff. And so he took an interest in me way beyond like the hours of school. And even though I grew up in a Christian home, he like took it upon himself to like, he bought me a Bible, and I was 12, right? So he bought me a Bible that was like meant for younger kids. And he kind of like, I don't want to say he led me to Christ, because I kind of did that on my own on an Easter Sunday. Actually, ironically, staying at my dad's house because I'd go there every other weekend. But if there was anybody that was more influential in my life to actually allow me to be led to Christ, it was him for sure. But it wasn't just that he bought me a Bible, but I remember I opened the first couple pages and there was like probably 100 verses that he had like handwritten in that he thought would be helpful and important. And as a kid, I don't think I realized like quite the amount of effort that took and thought that he put into it. But the very first one that he put in there was Psalm 68:5. And it talks about, it's David writing, and he talks about God being a father to the fatherless. And I read through a bunch of those and stuff. But I remember reading through it as probably an 8th grader going, like, he definitely knew what was going on with me, and he knew that I needed to hear that and stuff. And I don't think it's an accident that he put that one first. That was probably the first time that I realized that people other than me can, like, see the outward symptoms of somebody that had some abandonment issues. There's another verse in Psalm 68:6 that I want to talk about later, because I feel like not only did Psalm 68:5 become like a life verse for me, the very next verse says that God sets the lonely in families. And that kind of was like the culmination of my story, is we got to be able to adopt later, is that we were able to like live out that next verse. But anyways, one of the coping mechanisms I went to as a kid, there's all kinds of symptoms that can come up, right? So you have some kids that withdraw, you have some kids that act out. One of my coping mechanisms was that I developed a sense of humor to bring attention to myself. And I became a class clown. If you go back to my elementary years, like every single report card and progress report says like, Mark's desk is in the corner by himself because he like tries to make jokes all the time and stuff. And I didn't realize what I was doing. I just thought it was funny. And even if you go all the way fast forward to my high school yearbooks, if you're to read the comments in there, like everybody mentions like something about being funny, that like, funniest guy I know, you always make me laugh and stuff. And there wasn't much more to that they would say, which kind of led to another set of, questioning myself. But I could definitely look back now and say it was a coping mechanism that I used, was to get some sort of attention, even if it was negative sometimes. I didn't realize that the attention then was like medicinal for me. I just would do it. And I think Jamie would tell you, like, I haven't quite gotten out of that. I still use humor to deflect, like, and show true emotion sometimes. I kind of went through a cycle of trying to impress people and make sure they'd want to stay around me. I was very clingy. I don't think I quite grew out of that even by the time I met Jamie. I was very clingy emotionally, not just in romantic settings, but even in like friends setting and even with family. I was really, really clingy. In fact, so when I met Jamie, early on in our relationship, I think it was shortly after we got engaged, she went on this trip to Israel. You remember that, right? Of course you do. It's on my bucket list, but everything's on my bucket list she's already done. So anyways, how many days was that trip? Was it like 2 weeks?
14,
yeah.
something like that.
And so we would hang out all the time, right? And she went on this trip, and I wrote her a letter like every day. Every single day she was gone. Like and you could say that, right? Everybody says, oh, that's so cute. Like I needed that. Like I couldn't handle that disconnect, and I was like super, super clingy. And that's one of the things that sticks out to me. But I remember thinking, like, is this normal? Do people do this with their fiancés or girlfriends? And like all my friends were like, no, but but I did. And it wasn't until, I don't know how many years into our marriage where I came to the conclusion that she wasn't going anywhere. And I think we shared this before, that she would like go to the store and I'd freak out. But it wasn't until that point that I could be content in the fact that she was going to stick around. But let me read you a few stats and then I'll get into a little bit more about my story. But this is from fatherhood.org. It says here, and you can check this out. There's all kinds of stats everywhere online. Some of them are like national stats, some are state stats. It's very interesting because the percentages are very similar. But 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. That's 32 times the average. 85% of all children who show behavior disorders come from fatherless homes. That's 20 times the average. 71% of all high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. That's 9 times the average. Fatherless children are twice as likely to drop out of school. And if you're a mom who's abandoned your family, like, you're not off the hook or anything, but it's crazy that like the impact it has when a dad's out of the home. I'm sure there are stats that show what it looks like when a mom's out of the home, but that wasn't my story, so that's why I didn't. It's
not real popular these days to talk about the necessity of a father in a child's life. Right?
You need both. Like a mom can't be a dad can't be a mom.
Right.
And if you don't believe that, just pull it from stats. So 75% of all adolescent patients in chemical abuse centers come from fatherless homes. That's 10 times the average. 90% of incarcerated males grew up without a father figure in the house. 90%. That's crazy. And then it's weird because like there's like a catch-22, like a cycle that keeps happening because it says of America's roughly 2 million prisoners, over 800,000 of those are parents, and 90% of those 800,000 are fathers. So you have like a kid that grows up, or a boy that grows up without a dad, and he gets incarcerated, and he's got a son.
Right. He
or a
had
daughter.
a kid, then ends up in jail. That kid ends up without a dad.
So you have this cycle that perpetuates, and it's just like, we'll talk about it a little bit as we close, but I'm not sure what we do about it. But what's really important, I think, is that we pay attention that it's there and that it happens.
Sure.
I'll continue on my story, but what do you guys think?
Well, I guess I would ask, like, so we obviously see like for a child, what it looks like to not have a dad, to lose that father figure in their life, and how it affected you. And obviously it's a very personal thing, right? Like it affects your brothers differently, like
for
you
sure.
said.
Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, and I'm sure you're still working on it, as we all still work on our own things, like I'm working on my own stuff, so on and so forth. But how have you, like, what have you had to do to try to overcome some of those things, those symptoms? Like, what has helped you to cope? And I don't mean by developing, a sense of humor, but I mean, like, I'm sure that you've had to, through therapy and things like that, which we're both familiar with, you probably had to step back and kind of really question yourself and allow yourself to sit in some of those feelings, right? Because we try to avoid those things.
So something that, and again, I wasn't processing this in real time going, it would be helpful if I did, but I became very drawn to father figures. So like I would find myself at the neighbor's house where the dad was still around, and we'd be watching TV together. I got really into team sports and like felt very connected to coaches, I think at probably a higher level than some kids do. But one of the things that actually was very helpful in my high school years, and I actually spoke with this guy today through text, told him I was going to talk about him today. But I met a friend his name is Joe. I met him, I think we became really good friends like in 8th grade. And we kind of walked through junior high and high school together, like way closer than anybody else that I was friends with. We lived down the street from each other. We would walk to school every day. We would hang out at school. We played football together. We'd walk home together. There were many days I would spend playing video games at his house. And I don't think I realized then what an impact that had on me, because we both had some rough childhoods. And we didn't always like have deep conversations about that. We have now through text as adults. But I really feel like, and I know that he doesn't see the world the same way I do, but I feel like God put him in my life for a reason, and I needed that. And I feel like I was a much healthier person because I had a relationship with him the way that we did. And it was just kind of like a yin and a yang. Like, were the times when I was down, he was up, and vice versa. And so, Joe, if you're listening, thank you. I appreciate that. I didn't know that in the time, how important that was. But yeah, other than that, just being drawn to father figures and people being willing to step in and be that for me. Mm-hmm. Like, I have a super soft spot in my heart for stepdads and stepmoms who walk in and are willing to be that. And the kids aren't always receptive.
Right.
There was a stepmom in my life, like every other weekend when I visited my dad. And I'll talk about that. My dad didn't just like fall off the planet. I saw him every other weekend. But for step parents that step in and want to be that for someone else is like off the charts hero in my book. But
sure, I would agree with that statement. Yeah. And I don't have the same background as you do. Yeah. So it sounds like your relationship with Joe obviously was like a brother, a brotherhood. And I recognize that as well as having maybe a friend who's, at the risk of hurting feelings out there, but maybe is closer than your own brother, right?
Yeah, and I had brothers. They were just older, and so I won't even say that they didn't want to walk through it with me.
Sure.
I think part of the reason was they still had their own pain and issues to walk through, right? And so,
but to have somebody who's in the same age range as you and the same mindset, that kind of understanding of the world at that same time, right?
For sure,
that's huge. So, it's pretty much kind of goes for what we've seen, what we've experienced too with our own, things of abandonment, that God tends to fill those holes in our life, right, with people to help us in some way or another. And maybe it doesn't fill that void, but we can always hopefully get that kind of gift of hindsight, right?
Right. Yeah, like I said, I had this internal dialogue. I don't even know if it was healthy, but I just remember like having a ton of nights and like just being able to like inside my own head talk myself into the fact that I did matter and I was valued, and there are people out there with worse situations going on and stuff. Because you start to wrestle with things like, well, what was wrong with me that my dad didn't want to stick around?
Sure.
like, why didn't I matter enough and stuff? And I know it sounds very like immature to wrestle with those, because obviously there's a million reasons why families can split up.
I'm going to say that I feel like anybody who would call that immature for somebody who's going through that just doesn't know, and doesn't know, and just lacks compassion in general, because how could you look at somebody who's gone through something like that and then, wow, that guy really needs to grow up? That's ridiculous. You're hurting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But at the same time, you feel like tons of people have walked that same path, right?
You can't minimize what you've been through, though.
Yeah.
You can't minimize that. Like, that's got to be something that you allow yourself to have. Like, you've been through some stuff.
Yeah.
And you can't just turn it into something like, oh, other people have it worse.
Right.
Like, you have been through some stuff. Allow yourself to have that, you know?
Yeah. So, and I don't want to say it's a lonely feeling, but it's like you just said, like, you can't sit down with somebody who hasn't been there and get the, the right empathy and the right.
So what's interesting, I have to ask, like, based on the stats that you just read, we see that there are a lot of fatherless homes out there, right? A lot of people out there. And so it's interesting that even though that you're not alone, there are, right? It's the majority of kids in America these days, unfortunately.
Right.
The loneliness you still feel regardless, right?
Yeah.
So it's probably another symptom that comes from that.
Yeah, and I do think, like, even just studying for this, like, there are lots of things out there now where you can reach out.
Yeah.
And I don't know the stats of that. I just remember in kindergarten we learned about divorce for some reason. I don't think it was like a lesson, but there was only a couple of us in my class that were in that boat. And I feel like now if you took a kindergarten class and it would look much different.
It would almost feel like it was the majority. Right?
And I don't know why that is. I mean, I have some guesses, but it's definitely not like this marginalized, like, never happens.
Right.
Right. Hopefully there's 1 in a million listening to this podcast. It's not that. There's a ton of people there.
I always fall back to that saying, and by now it's probably cliche, but I've just learned it within the last couple of years, but it's always hurt people, right? Those people are probably a product of some sort of hurt from their own family and their previous generations, so on and so forth, and it just continues, unfortunately. So there has to be a chain breaker, right? You have to have somebody who's deciding not to perpetuate that same trauma to somebody else.
Yeah. And what's weird is that, like, I shared this in a previous podcast, but I think every person that goes through something traumatic tells themselves they're going to be a chain breaker, right? Like, I would never.
Right.
Having said that, a bunch of them still perpetuate that same pattern.
Sure.
And you can look it up. Like, we won't get into it tonight, but the way that a absent dad affects a daughter is different than a way an absent dad affects a son. And sometimes with girls, it looks like promiscuity and they struggle with relationships with guys. And sometimes for guys, it looks like controlling behavior and stuff. And so it looks different. And I would imagine that an absent mom would have different impacts on male and female too.
Sure.
But it's interesting.
So let's go back to the relationship with your dad then, because you were saying that he didn't kind of step out of your life completely. You saw him every other weekend. So what happened there?
So here's what it looked like. So right away, they had joint custody, but I lived with my mom. And so every other weekend we'd get in the car. There was a season where some Wednesday nights my dad would take us out for dinner. And he actually had a pretty long drive to get there. So I won't say that he put zero effort in. It seemed like, from my perspective, he's going through the motions a little bit, because when we were around him, he wasn't super interested. In between those every other weekends, we wouldn't get phone calls. There was sporadic spread in there. But it felt like, and I haven't talked all this through with him.
Sure.
I've reached out lately, and I'll get into that later, but it felt like he was a dad for everybody that may have been watching, but not for the right reasons. And so, anyway, so he was disconnected. And so when we would go out to his house for the weekends, sometimes there was a babysitter there for us. And sometimes there were, he had a decent amount of wealth. And so he would buy us stuff that would maybe keep us busy and occupied and stuff. So it just felt like there wasn't a deep connection. It was like a distant uncle. Like, hey, I know who you are. I know what grade you're in and stuff, but we couldn't talk about anything. And so that's how it kind of continued. I will say that my high school days, he put a little more effort in. Like, he went to my football games and stuff. Oh. And so that was like an uptick for me. It was like a little bit of a relationship building. A bunch of circumstances happened in my adult life and early married life. Some involved me, some involved my siblings, that kind of put a big fracture in our relationship. And then about 5 years now, maybe, his second marriage ended. And I did do a quick, like, little reach out, like, hey, I'm sorry that happened. Like, if you want to, like, get together and talk about it and stuff. And I was met with, like, a wall, like, not interested type thing. Now, that took a lot of courage on my part because that girl he divorced, or did divorce him, I would imagine, was the one he left my mom for.
Sure.
And so, like, I won't say I prayed for it, but I had hope for years that marriage would fail.
Sure.
And here I am having to call and say, like, I'm really sorry that happened. Like, took a lot on my part. And so to be met with that, I was just kind of like, well, I guess this is how it's going to be. I ran into him at my sister's wedding a few years ago, and it was super awkward. So that's kind of what it looked like. He wasn't, like, off the planet. I know some people's abandonment is, like, never saw him again, or I never met the guy type thing. Mine was, like, sporadic but not really involved, I guess you could word it as. So it felt the same, but that's what it looked like. I don't know if you want to add anything. You probably have a unique vantage point of, like, I was really clingy. So, like, I had a couple of, like, serious relationships in high school with girls, and that clinginess, I think, ended both of them. It was like, it was too much for both of them. Like, whoa, like, I'm not your mom and your girlfriend and your, you know. And I was just like, I need somebody to, like, realize that they're going to, like, I'm important to them and they're not going to go anywhere. And so I don't know how much of that was still left when I met you, but.
I wouldn't say that I felt like you were overwhelmingly clingy, that, like, you were saying you just needed some clarification that, like, it was okay that I was leaving the house, I would be back later, like, type thing, at first. And I just thought that was a little quirky. Like, it didn't really, like, I mean, it wasn't like a huge red flag for me or anything like that. Like, you say freaked out, but it wasn't like that dramatic. It was just like, where are you going when you're coming back? Type
I
thing.
wasn't like chasing you down the street.
No,
right? But
it wasn't like you were like crying, holding my ankle or something like that. Like, it was more of a, like, I don't know, maybe it was more internal, but the outward expression of it was more just like, oh, where are you going? Oh, when are you coming back? Type thing. And I didn't feel like it was in a controlling sense. It was just like, you really just genuinely wanted to know. So, and not to, like, call out, and I'm not here to, like, lecture anybody or call anybody out, but sometimes it does manifest in a controlling way. And I've seen that in some of my siblings. And I've heard that when you go through a season of, like, you can't control anything, you, like, swing back and, like, over control your life. And so luckily I didn't get that symptom, but I never got the controlling thing from you. It was just, more just like you just wanted reassurance more than having control. There was you've never been the angry type. So I think if you attach anger and that sense of, like, needing to know, like, I think that's when it morphs into controlling, but that's never the type of personality you had, so it just didn't come off that way.
So as a kid, I actually had I see I was a class clown, right? But there was a season in my childhood where everybody called me Mute Boy because I just didn't talk. Jamie doesn't know Mute Boy and can't understand that happened until my brother told her that he called us that.
When we first started, like, when we first got engaged, he would start going to, like, family events and stuff like that. And then when we were first married, and my family would ask me, does he ever talk? And I was like,
are you kidding?
All the time. Just maybe
he
not
won't shut
here.
Up. Yeah, I bring him here, so he'll stop.
Yeah. No, he. That was the only time I ever saw him, like, be quiet, was when he was just, like, around my family, because it was just all people he didn't know. So I mean, that made sense to me. Like, why would he? But eventually he came around and started talking.
Yeah. And that was weird too, because when we were in full-time ministry for a while, and I actually had to do a bunch of public speaking, and so it was weird. My family's like, "You're gonna be doing public speaking?" Like, yeah, right. So it was interesting.
Maybe it's that you could feel like you couldn't talk around them. I don't know.
Could be. Yeah, I don't remember honestly. Like, we've kind of like my oldest brother and I are close, and we've kind of, like, diffused a lot of our pain with humor, and we've kind of, like I said, we're in different seasons, but we've never really sat down and really ran through what it felt like.
Sure. So it's interesting because it sounds pretty innocuous, right? Like, she sees it as you're just asking, hey, where are you going? When are you going to be back? Like, whatever. Like, you just want to know. But realistically, inside, you're kind of freaking out, right? Like, wow, this could be a real thing. So it makes me wonder if these questions that most people would think, like, why are they bothering to ask me that? Like, it could be due to something else, right? Like, what are we not thinking about? You know, from that person's perspective. And so I wanted to ask. Sure. And at risk of getting really deep here, but, like, do you know much about your dad's history and, like, what he's been through to make him feel like, you know?
Yeah. So, and actually the way I was going to close today, we can just talk about it now, was I have a deep, like, desire to learn people's backstory now because I love going back a generation or two, even just a few years or so. I do know a little bit about my dad's history, and that's only through my mom. I haven't talked to him about it, and she's been able to my mom's been really good. My mom never deserted us. She was gone because she had to work. But a lot of people would say I don't have either parent want anything to do with me, and I had one that wanted everything to do with me. But she's in this unique position where she's like, I'm not gonna sugarcoat and make your dad look better than he was. I know if I'm honest, it'll hurt you, and you probably already know yourself how he was. But she's been able to share with me a little bit of his past, and so I kind of see his childhood wasn't good. Yeah, I know that for sure. He had a brother that his parents really praised and stuff, and he was kind of not the one that was getting praised and stuff. And so I know a little bit for sure. Yeah, and it's definitely, if you're in that situation, definitely look into that because it helps you kind of see through a different lens.
Yeah, I asked that question because in my own life, my dad, he's always had this kind of more selfish streak, and I've always kind of resented that. I never cared for that. And then, so with stuff that I've been through recently and everything, I decided to just kind of ask him. I was opening and being really kind of vulnerable with him, telling him about the things that I've experienced and what I'm feeling and stuff. And he surprisingly opened up to me about the stuff that he went through as a kid. And it was horrifying, the stuff. And no wonder. It's not selfishness that's coming from so much as it is just survival.
I guess, self-preservation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see why, because that was his whole life up until the point that he got, a good job and he did all it. So it changed my perspective from this kind of selfish person to this person who I guess just did the best they could with what they had, with what they had to offer, and maybe he doesn't see it that way, but I do, and I'm not trying to offer that as some comfort to you because obviously, your situation is very different, but I would encourage people, like you said, to always try and learn the backstory because there's so much more that just changes everything, it just changes everything.
Right. Because you have an incomplete picture before that of what. Now, how did that look going forward with your relationship with your dad? Did that?
It's been rocky, but it's getting better, it's been getting better. We've always had a good relationship. It's just we disagree on a lot of things, and there's no depth to the conversations. We start to disagree, and he'll end it. He wants to change the subject, and we don't ever get to discuss anything. So it's frustrating for me because I love this stuff. I'll parse this stuff out until we're way in the weeds, and but he's just not that guy, and I have to kind of take a step back and understand why. Because there's a lot there that he was protecting himself from.
Right. And I think, honestly, not to go off topic, but I think that looking for the backstory is just a good general rule to carry in life because I think what set me off on that, looking deeper into that, was when we actually had a youth group we were leading, my wife and I, and there was a girl that would just constantly be interrupting and talking nonstop, and it was an interruption to the group. And so there were times where I had to take her outside and say you can't do that, and so we had to drop her off one night because her parents didn't come to pick her up, and we got a little glimpse of what that house was like, and nobody listened to her. She was not heard, and so she spent the rest of her time outside the house trying to be heard. And so I never looked at her the same way after that. Right. And so that set me off of oh man, I thought I had a clear picture of why and what, and I didn't have a clue. Right. And so that kind of set me off on looking at people's backstories. But for sure, that's something you'd want to wrestle through if you're struggling with this. I think what you're going to find is that there's reasons for why people tend to bail on their families. So not to take away any. Yeah, it's a bad decision to do that.
It's a bad decision, but it still hurts. It creates a bunch of trauma, but we go back to that hurt people, right? Right. So let's just come around now to where you are now in life. Yeah. Everything you've been through, obviously, you've developed certain coping mechanisms, things like that. But you sought therapy and all those things. What have you been able to do that has actually helped? And what do you think that looks like now compared to where you were?
Like I said, Mr. DeMille, Joe, and now Jamie, I think was a big part of that healing. Therapy was part of it. Therapy was important, but I really feel like God put some people in my life at the right times for the right lengths that was helpful. And honestly, if I could go back and change something, I'm not sure what I would, if any. I feel like I'm a better dad because of that. I feel like my kids are getting a better version of me. Sure. Because of what I walk through. And I think you can say that for a lot of things in life. I still, Jamie, we just talked about this the other day in our other podcast. I want to go everywhere as a foursome. Whereas it may be healthier and better for us to go as a twosome and a threesome and a
Sure.
onesome. Is that a word? Sometimes. But yeah, I think that just being put in certain things. So when you read scripture, God uses the family unit to describe lots of things, right? So he calls the church his bride. He uses marriage to show what a true like sacrificial relationship should look like. And there are a lot of people out there, and this is not some kind of lecture on people that preach or anything, but so many people out there say that like he puts it in terms we can understand, right? He calls that because we already understand a family, and I honestly think that's completely backwards. He created the family and the marriage unit and stuff to be able to show us who he is and the characteristics he already had, because he's the creator, right? So it's not like he created and was like, hey, I have an idea now that I've created that. I could use. It's the opposite of that. We wouldn't understand what he's trying to tell us if we couldn't see that. We couldn't be moms and daughters. He could have just created the whole population like we all were born at once. But he needed to see what that we can relate to moms and dads and stuff to tell us more about himself.
So it kind of sounds to me like it goes back to that whole like no man is an island, right? God has put some people in your life that help you heal a lot of those wounds.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're paying attention.
And that goes back to that kind of the, biblical saying of bearing each other's burdens. That's what we're supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Help each other through this.
Yeah.
Because it's tough.
Yeah. And I'm not sure you don't even need to have the right words, right? So people listening to this, they're either going to be the Marks, they're going to be the Joes, they're going to be the Mr. DeMills. You may even be the Mark's dad in this story, right? Like, but if you're like walking with somebody or around somebody, or you notice somebody's got some kind of symptoms of abandonment, I don't even think you need words. You just got to like sit in it with them sometimes. Figure out a way to let them know that they're valued.
Sure. So what would you say to somebody who maybe is, let's say, a younger version of you, of where you were at this point, and maybe not married in a relationship, doesn't think that they have those relationships? What advice would you offer them?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure. I mean, I don't think that you should try to find your value in the way that people treat you. Like, your value is separate from that, I think, right? You either are you're valuable or you're not, and everybody is, in my opinion. So I don't think if you're using that as a barometer for your self-esteem and your identity is a good plan in life. I think you got to figure out a way to find out where that comes from. For me, that led me to Christ. For other people, it's going to lead them to addiction. It's going to lead them all kinds of things that are not good.
Right.
But I really think that's what people would be searching for in that situation. Like, am I valuable or not? Do I matter or not?
Sure.
And that's, like, I think the first thing you got to come to is like,
Sure.
If I don't, why not? And if I do, why? Kind of thing.
Sure. And so just to segue off of this topic, but based on what you're saying, like, I can identify with that. And I had both my parents growing up, but I mean, up to a couple of years ago, I remember saying, I don't even know who I am, right? Because I'd lost my identity at some point. I think it's a very common thing for people to go through. And like you're saying, for me and for you, for everybody at this group, I'm sure, the only true way to find your identity is to find your identity in Christ, right? Other people are going to find it elsewhere. And I think what they'll tend to find is that it's just not lasting.
Don't you think we're kind of all born with that question of like, who am I?
Absolutely.
Like,
absolutely.
What's my value? Where'd I get that from? And what's my identity? Like, I think there are people that go to great lengths to hide the fact that they're wrestling with that.
Sure.
But I don't think that's something we learn. I think it's something we're born with.
Sure.
Wanting to be validated, valued, protected.
Yeah. I would think if you're out there and you're struggling with any of this stuff, that there's no shame to seeking therapy. There's no shame to trying to get deeper into this and figuring it out, talk to people and really try to take a step back in your life and maybe look at the relationships that you have that maybe you really didn't think much of before or didn't stand out, but they're there because they're there for a reason.
Right. And I would even say if you're in this season that I'm in or in the point at which I'm at, if you recognize some of those and have a chance to go back and let them know how important that was in your life, like, go for that if you can. Yeah. It's pretty neat to because I think there are people that are the Joes and the Mr. DeMills that would never know how impactful they were unless you give them a chance to tell them. So,
right.
If I could just speak for a moment on my perspective, I didn't grow up with the abandonment and stuff like that, so I can't fully relate to that experience. But I can, in watching Mark, I can kind of see how God put him on a path to to break that chain, it doesn't have to perpetuate itself into the next generation and the next generation. You can make that choice to be the one that changes things. And I've seen Mark do that, like full 180 in his own life, just making that choice to, even without really a father figure full time in his life, he still manages to be an awesome dad. And that's like the utmost importance to him, and he really prioritizes that, and that's so great to watch from my perspective, because I know that it takes work, and I can see how God instilled things in him along his path because he was following God, that God put those people in his life, and that God really kind of healed a lot of those wounds and taught him anyways what it means to be a father, even though he didn't really have that example so much growing up. You wouldn't know that watching him with his kids. So it's amazing when you choose to follow God, like the things that he can do to change your experiences, and even use those wounds as benefits to your future and your own kids and things like that. It's incredible to watch from the outside. I just wanted to say that part.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine, based on what you're saying, and for you, Mark, on some level, that just being the dad that you are provides some sort of catharsis to you, some healing of those wounds, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, just in the sense that, like, my kids aren't going to walk a different path than I did, right?
Right.
And so, and I don't mean this to be, like, I promise you, up until like 2 minutes before we started tonight, I was looking for a way to get out of doing this topic. Like, this is not something I enjoyed or wanted to talk about. But if you have been there the way I have, please allow yourself to be helpful and make yourself available to somebody else who may be walking that. That's the only reason I'm doing this. And I know that I can say for people out there, like, I've been there, whereas other people can't.
Sure.
And I know Jim could say that about other situations. I know Anna could say that about other situations that I haven't walked in. And you guys could say, I've been there, and you and Jamie as well. And so I'm not doing this in any way because I get anything out of it. In fact, I'd rather not talk about it.
I think what's great about it, though, is it's twofold, because you're not only a better dad because of everything, but you're also sharing with other people.
how you're helping other people too.
Yeah, so it's twofold. Your story, it could have taken you down. There's a lot of people either unknowingly or even knowingly will say, well, I had a bad childhood, that's why I am the way I am,
Yeah,
or they don't know,
yeah.
and then they perpetuate.
Right.
Yeah, and that brings up another point. So the worst part of my character and the worst choices I've made in life probably had something to do with some wounds I've had. However, they're all decisions I made, and there's no getting out of that responsibility. There's still, I still had a choice to choose to do good or choose to do bad, and then those times that I've chosen to do bad, it's not my dad's fault.
Right.
I take full responsibility of that, and I think that's important to get it out there, because I think a lot of people live in that victimhood and say, I'm incapable of making good choices.
Sure.
And it's twofold. You got to own the bad ones, and you got to make the good ones. So
real quick, I know that we've kind of like, we're talking about abandonment. We're talking about, right, you have very specific history and stuff, but I also know that Anna, who's been pretty quiet this entire time, has also suffered from abandonment. Hers looks different. Yours is from a child at a young age. Hers, I mean, I was there when it happened.
True.
She was an adult already, married, and she had one of her parents walk out on her, and so there's a different perspective there as well. Like, it can look like different things, because I remember there's been things that she struggled through. Like, do you want to talk about that, or
just to summarize?
Are you also apprehensive in the way I am to want to?
I mean, I've shared my story many times. It's more about trying to make it concise in just a few minutes. But to start, I was young. I was about to become a mom for the first time. And when I was about 8 months along, in a real nutshell, my mom decided to leave my family, leave my dad and my younger brother, who was still living in the home. I was about to become a mom. That's like one of the moments you need your mom, And she decided to leave the family and pursue another lifestyle, and essentially just removed herself almost completely. And then when called out on it or asked why, she said, it's my turn to be selfish. What a weird timing to take that opportunity to be selfish, in my opinion. So I was kind of left on my own for a lot of those things. I mean, I had friends and things, but there's just something to losing your mom when you're about to be a mom. So, I definitely struggled with that a lot. I remember sitting up a few weeks after all of it went down and stuff, and I just woke up one morning and I just cried out to God. I was like, I need something from you, because this is just, like, it's hard to explain that pain, And I just opened my Bible. I don't normally do that. I don't just open my Bible. I'm like, oh, look, it's amazing. No, but this time I did. I opened my Bible, and it opened to Isaiah 49:15, and, And it says, can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even though she may forget, I will not forget. And I just could not believe that. And so when you brought up the scripture that your teacher had given you, that was just, it's amazing how God. And so it seems like an odd life verse, but if I was to pick one, I'd pick that one, because, my mom should be the one person on earth that doesn't leave you behind, and she chose to, but God has never left me behind, and he has always provided some form of surrogate mother for me, and whether it was for long seasons or short seasons. I have a great relationship with my mother-in-law, which there's a lot of people who cannot say that, and so who would think, and just, so God's really blessed that whole story.
So it's amazing to me, like, I just want to point this out, like, Mark, was given a Bible, and there's a verse in there that talks to children, sons who've lost their fathers, and there's a verse in here that talks about children who have lost their mothers, right? And so that this is a very known thing. Like, God spells it out. Like,
it's not new.
But God spells it out. Like, even though they forget you or they walk away from you, I never will. And I really want to reinforce that for anybody out there who's listening. If you have not taken a look at Christianity in a realistic matter, I think that there's a lot more to it than anybody gives it credence, Yeah.
There are all sorts of religions where you can work your way into favor for whatever deity that is, right? And there's only one where God tells you he'll meet you where you are, right? You don't have to work your way into something.
True.
And he perfectly demonstrated the very love he calls you to, right?
So if you don't mind me asking, I had talked a little bit about reaching out to my dad later on. Has any of that, like, what does your relationship with your mom look like today? Non-existent.
She literally moved across the country. Maybe the occasional happy birthday or Merry Christmas text, but that's about it. When she said those words, it's my turn to be selfish, that's pretty much when I shut myself off from her, because it went beyond that with her whole side of the family. It was a lot deeper than just that.
To be fair, she's a fairly toxic person, so I would
there,
say there's
if
a manipulation of
about,
emotions every time that we've ever been involved with her. It's always she manipulates you to feel like she's the victim every single time.
So I would say maybe in my childhood I had maybe an emotional abandonment situation with her, and then she just chose to finally physically leave later and picked a really terrible time to do so.
Right, and in some ways it goes down one generation, right? Because your kids don't have a grandma. Right.
Well, actually they have plenty. That's what's kind of great about it. Yeah, but I kind of look at it now, and as he pointed out, that it's kind of a toxic. Many members of that side of the family are kind of toxic, very women power, and don't respect your husbands, and they weren't firm believers in the whole teamwork side of parenting. So I look at God being sovereign, and maybe he allowed that removal just in time.
Right.
So, yeah.
Interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it, for sure. Probably not in the moment were you realizing that, but
it's been almost 10 years since all that went down. So
yeah. So you said you were going to talk more about kind of reaching out to your dad today, or like, nowadays. Have you done that? Has anything come from that?
Like I said, the most recent was in his most recent divorce. So that was a few years back. And again, I ran into him at my sister's wedding, and it just doesn't seem like it's meant to go much further than that. It's actually sad, because that's the first time he saw our kids. I got to introduce his grandkids to him, and that was, and that's partly by choice that I've kept, like, maybe for some of the same reasons as the toxicity, where I've kind of kept them away. But they ask those questions. We talked about it last week, right? Like, they're going to ask those questions that you're going to struggle to answer. And
just to throw this out there, my kids know surface level of what happened. Yeah. But my daughter, once in a while, just out of the blue, will say, I feel like we should pray for your mom today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she has not even seen my mom since she was 1.
Yeah.
So it's pretty crazy.
I've had moments putting my son to sleep where he's like sad for me. I'm so sad, Daddy, that you didn't have a dad. And I'm like, I've been sad enough for both of us. You don't need to be sad also. And I keep telling him, like, I'm only who I am today because I went through that.
How cool is that, that he sees, like, he values you so much in that role that he said that you didn't get that.
He's so empathetic about it, but I try to not don't let him worry about it. But
we've told them, like, it's more sad for that grandpa that he's missing out on the time with them and getting to know them and how special they are and stuff. And he doesn't even realize that he's missing out on that. So, and that's pretty sad too.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just say, I know this is not necessarily a Christian podcast, but we obviously are all 4 of us believers. And so we raise our families in that manner. And so I can't help but come from that perspective that, like, whatever your wound is, like, we all have them, God can heal and bring about amazing things from those. And I've seen it in my life, and I've seen it in so many others' lives. Genuinely, it's amazing to watch just like how broken you can come to God with all your broken pieces, and he can build the most beautiful thing out of it. And it's amazing to see. And I've had the perspective of following God and believing God my whole life. But I mean, a lot of people come to him later on in life. I mean, I've obviously had wounds too that I brought to him, but a lot of people come to him later on in life, just so many wounds and so many broken pieces. And still he can just put all that together and make it into the most beautiful thing. And I would just challenge you to try it out. Try it. I mean,
well, you can try other stuff, right? There's plenty of other things you can try to fill that void with, but it won't work.
Yeah, I promise you, the only thing that will stick is this.
Yeah,
that's why we've said it before, right? Like, God is the foundation, right? He doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, same today, same tomorrow. Will always be the same. The world is always changing. The current fad is always changing. The current social image is always changing. So if you want stability in your life, something to know will always be there, will always be the same, and meets you where you're at. I think that's super important. Seriously, look into it, consider it. And a big part of that is actually opening up the Bible and reading it, right? These verses that just kind of, they're not there just out of nowhere. It doesn't.
Yeah. I feel like that verse was written for me, and some other people got some stuff out of it too. Like, that's how I look at it. Like, it spoke to me.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, it's how many years ago was it written? And it still
applies.
Relevant. And
I mean, in all of time and everything like that, the specks of dust that we all are on this earth, right? That reached out to you.
Yeah.
That was so personal to you, right? I truly believe that the Bible has that for everyone on this planet. You know, they just have to look.
Thank you for listening to the Family Brew podcast. Where can they find us at?
Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
And what should they do when they get there?
Follow us.
What else can they do when they get there, buddy?
They can suggest new coffee flavors and suggest new ideas for episodes and much more.
Sounds good.